Edmonds. I am CEO of TTS. I'm going to fix my collar here. Welcome to our webinar today, talking all about cybersecurity risk management and what you can do to be proactive to protect your business holistically against the growing cyber threat. As I mentioned before, I am CEO of TTS. TTS is a premier cybersecurity company. We specialize in the SMB, SME, particularly with a focus on companies around 100 employees or less. Now, we do go outside those bounds from time to time and on a case-by-case basis, and we have risk assessments that go all the way up to the, I call the micro enterprise of like 1,000 employees plus, but I digress. We do cybersecurity and we do risk management and cybersecurity daily. We're all about helping small businesses, small, medium enterprises be proactive on managing this cyber risk. So today's topic, cyber risk, right? Cyber risk is just a new addition to an existing conversation business leadership has been having for, oh my gosh, a long time. Risk management. How do we manage risk? There's all kinds of different risks. There's financial risk, there's legal risk, there's operational risk, there's reputational risk. And cyber ties into all these risk conversations and just adds a new element that needs to be managed. Well, how have we been managing risk overall? We've been managing risk, as you probably can imagine, for centuries now as businesses. So there's, broadly speaking, with a few asterisks and exceptions, 5 accepted ways to manage risk of any kind. And those are in order: avoidance, transferring, retention, loss prevention, and reduction, and sharing as well. Sorry. Avoidance, transferring, retention, loss prevention, and reduction, sharing. We're going to talk about all 5 of these and how they relate to cyber. There are some that are more effective than others, and some that have some very interesting, shall we say, red tape around them. And we're going to go through each and every one of them. The reason we have to talk about cyber risk and where is cyber risk coming from? Well, obviously, it's innovation technology. Technology is revolutionizing the way businesses are operating. There's no doubt about that. Generative AI alone, game changer. My team and I have been playing with Microsoft Copilot, which is basically ChatGPT baked into Microsoft Office. It's going to be hugely instrumental. I can already see it in our own daily workflows. And that's awesome. It gives us a chance to scale more efficiently, to increase productivity. But as with most opportunities, there are inherent risks that need to be managed and understood with any kind of technology innovation. And technology is changing rapidly. So every 6 months, it feels like the goalposts of what it means to understand cyber risk it changes slightly. And over time, that risk is pretty significant, or that change is pretty significant in what the definition of the risk is. For today, I am going to give cybersecurity risk an actual proper definition for the terms of this discussion. This is the most technical I will get in this entire event. So what is cybersecurity risk? Cybersecurity risk refers to the potential for unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction of information in a business. It can also entail financial losses, damage to an organization's reputation, and legal repercussions. It's influenced by a firm's use of technology, the nature of its business operations, and the strategies in place to safeguard against a range of vulnerabilities and threats. That was a really, really, really dry definition, but it's very, very adequate. Now, what does that look like in normal business? That's probably what you're asking, right? Like, you give me a definition, be more specific to me, right? Logan, how does this look like for me? Okay, I got you. So examples of cybersecurity risk, if we want to get tactical, right? Like specific risks that are found all the time in companies. Phishing attacks. I get phishing literally, I think, daily at this point, and that's with proper filters, spam filters, and security tools. Phishing attacks using the vehicle emails when someone tries to trick you into sharing sensitive information. That can be just getting you to click a link so they can put malware on your computer to monitor stuff. That can be trying to take you to that web page to steal your passwords. It can be pretending somebody you trust. Generative AI is getting super good, unfortunately, at mimicking human speech, as we've seen with ChatGPT, and I think Google just renamed it, but it was called Bard. So generative AI is a great example of this. It used to be if a criminal wanted to email a phishing link, for example, to you, they had to have a pretty decent understanding of the English language, or it was pretty obvious it was a phishing email, right? Like we're all sending the broken English emails. Generative AI came into the chat, and it turns out large language models like ChatGPT speak pretty good English and are pretty easy to use. So criminals are absolutely using them for phishing. It can be ransomware as well. Ransomware is, unless you've been living under a rock somewhere, pretty well understood at this point, broadly speaking. But to give a brief definition of what I'm talking about, ransomware is basically extorting. It either holds your data hostage, where they do what's called encryption on your data, makes it unreadable. Ransomware operators are particularly good at destroying backups. So even if you're backing things up, they can still hold it hostage, and they say, pay us to give you your data back, or we'll just take away all your company's data. More recently, they have moved into blackmail tactics as well, which it always was a little extortion tactic, but now they're taking copies of the data. We're seeing more and more saying, hey, what in this is legally compromising? What is it? Something that the business doesn't want getting out to the public, that might be contractually sensitive, that might be legally sensitive under regulatory bodies. And they're going to the business owner or the business leadership directly and saying, hey, yeah, we're holding you for ransom. And the fact that if you don't pay us to go away, we're going to go dump this information at a regulatory body or journalism reg. Most recently, we saw a bunch of cyber criminals who were working with bad ransom to publicly traded company, allegedly. They reported that publicly traded company to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, saying, hey, you have laws now that say that these companies are supposed to disclose when they got hacked. These guys never disclosed when we hacked them. We have proof. Here's the evidence. Unfortunately for that publicly traded company, the law had not gotten effect yet. They still had about 3 weeks. The attackers did not look at the dates that well. But the fact that they were willing to do that to basically use a government body, that was a huge deal in this world. That was a huge deal and honestly, escalation in extortion tactics. Large troves of legally sensitive data, such as personally identifiable information. PII is one of those things that unfortunately is a lot broader than most people understand. It's everything from email addresses to phone numbers to addresses. And it's data that every state in the United States, for example, requires that if you lose it, you've got to tell the person it affected and potentially even make a public disclosure. One of the big places I see PII all the time, if you have a Mac or a PC, the downloads folder of your computer. Whenever you download something on your computer, a file, a PDF, whatever, a Excel spreadsheet, whatever, it goes somewhere. And I strongly recommend at least once a year cleaning out the downloads folder of your computer. The amount of cybersecurity risk assessments I've done, where there's been thousands of records of PII just sitting in someone's desktop or downloads folder, has been absolutely mind-boggling. And last but not least, outdated software. Turns out criminals like to hack software. They like to figure out Sorry, clicked the wrong button. They like to figure out what they can do to break into legitimate software to use it as a vehicle to infect and spread their reach. Google Chrome feels like, for example, is updating every week with 0 day, not every week, that's a probably exaggeration, but you constantly need to be updating your software because when these criminals figure out how to break it, especially things that we call 0 days or critical level vulnerabilities, it's a race against time. How quickly can Google get you to update before the criminal exploits it? It's a real problem. All these things are legitimate cybersecurity risk examples. The last thing I'm going to mention before we take a 60-second break to allow for questions, a lot of people have an assumption the cloud manages these risks. They just assume because they're paying for a SaaS license or cloud infrastructure, it's one of the big dogs problem. Microsoft, AWS, Google. What we're seeing is statistics in hacking, what we call, the reports after we're done on hacking attacks. That's just simply not the case. 82% of the cyber attacks that I'm referencing today happen in the cloud, public, private, or in multiple environments. Big reasoning behind that, unfortunately, is a little box that we all check I accept to and never actually read the terms and conditions. Microsoft, Google, AWS, if it's something to do with their infrastructure, so their employees and their access, they absolutely defend that. And that's very fair to say. Microsoft is one of the most robust security teams on the planet. That being said, in every single one of their terms and conditions, they specifically tell you, hey, your user credential, if your user access is used to accomplish this breach, we have no liability in this. If your password, for example, is used to steal data out of your email or your Google Drive or your OneDrive or whatever, it's not our problem. As of a year ago, and I have to reread Microsoft's terms and conditions, I'm a little dated, but as of a year ago, Microsoft reworded their terms and conditions, actually, to my understanding, that seemed to indicate they were reserving the right to actually sue the people who accepted the terms and conditions if their negligence ended up going back on Microsoft and causing fiscal harm. They considered it a form of negligence. So terms and conditions waive away a lot of that responsibility from the cloud providers, and What you're paying for when you pay for a cloud license, generally speaking, is scalability, SaaS architecture and uptime, and the equipment. Because at the end of the day, cloud is just somebody else's computer. It's a data center, a server, some warehouse, and somebody's taking care of that server physically, make sure it stays up and running, make sure it's available to you, make sure it runs smoothly. But they're not protecting it on a cybersecurity level to any meaningful degree that's going to impact for the purpose of this conversation. There is some asterisk and some outside. If you're in the development team, I could see that, and that's a whole separate conversation. If you want to talk about that, schedule either the QR code in the top left-hand corner of this video or the link in the banner for a free cyber strategy session. We can definitely take you through that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here for 60 seconds. The little video is going to play, and I'm going to allow for people to put questions in the chat. We're on YouTube, we're streaming on StreamYard, and we're also on LinkedIn. So go ahead and comment in the chat below. And once these 60 seconds are up, somebody will be commenting in the chat as well. Fortunately, due to travel obligations, I am recording this. So we'll be doing all Q&A in the chat via responses. 60 seconds starting now. Welcome back. Please keep putting your questions in the comments. We are having representatives from our team standing by to answer them, cybersecurity engineers, and probably myself for all intents and purposes. So before we go into some more specifics here, I do want to reference one more piece of viable statistics. So the FBI IC3 team is a public resource for organizations to submit reports of cyber attacks and incidents. I'm still waiting on to get my hands on the 2023 report, so I'm going to pull today's slides from the 2022 report, which was released early last year. And I read this thing, and it tells about trends and statistics and sort of input from the FBI. And three things stood out to me. One, business email compromise, stands for BEC, was a significant threat in 2022. It received over 21,832 public complaints, totaling more than 2.7 billion in adjusted losses. BEC methods have evolved and become more sophisticated as well. And remember, these stats, just to clarify, are the only organizations that have gone public. I know for a fact, I'm sure several of you know for a fact as well, many organizations that prefer not to go public about being breached or not to engage or not to let anybody know. This is just the ones that went public enough to go to the FBI. Ransomware is another threat that cannot be ignored. The IC3 received over 2,385 ransomware complaints in 2022, and SaaS ransomware is a growing threat. And last but not least, call center fraud victims. Call center fraud costs victims over $1 billion. Good old call center fraud, primarily falling into different kinds of fraud, types of fraud, tech support, and government impersonation. And for those of you who are thinking, man, that would never work on anyone who really was paying attention, this is allegedly, of course. We don't know all the details because it's not 100% public, but allegedly, most of the professional scuttlebutt involving the MGM casino breach of last year, that was probably started, most likely, allegedly, by call center impersonation. Someone called an MGM casino, according to the scuttlebutt, and managed to use that. Now, again, this is alleged, but I would believe it. I see it happen all the time in my daily organization and the clients that we work with. And to clarify on one thing real quick, something that's just brought to my attention, business email compromise is quite simply what it sounds like. Hackers getting into various business emails, either to take emails outside, take sensitive information from the email and read it and use it for an attack because they use data, they gather intelligence like any kind of criminal, or to use that email as in its authority, its legitimacy, to email somebody else who normally wouldn't answer them. For example, if you hack into a vendor's account, you can email all their clients and they think it's coming from the trusted vendor. Software tools are notorious for getting popped for this kind of stuff in terms of being targeted and being used in this manner. And I actually have a story revolving business email compromise and call center fraud. So, disclaimer, this is a client that we actually worked with. So I don't want to disclose who they are for obvious confidentiality reasons. So I'm going to be changing a couple key details here, as well as being a little bit vague on some stuff, just to keep all identities of all safe who are involved. But we actually had to deal with a business email compromise and a fraud claim. And spoilers, this whole issue for a small organization ended in a significant loss. So there was a smaller nonprofit with staff we worked with. Staff was between 5 to 12 on inside. Not super affluent, very tight budget, as you can imagine. A lot of nonprofits at the size are absolutely in that same place. This nonprofit knew they had cybersecurity risk. They'd even gotten a cybersecurity risk assessment where it had been presented to them and recommendations, but they just couldn't believe. They just couldn't believe that they were actually a threat, right? Like they couldn't believe that anyone would actually target them. They're just a little guy, right? I'm such a small organization. We're nonprofit to boot. Why would a cyber criminal spend time on us? Fast forward about 2 months after the risk assessment. What we found was that, like any organization, they had a chief executive, they had an administrator slash operation person, and they had a financial administrator, sort of the CEO, CFO, and COO functionality that you find in a corporate job, only the nonprofit version. And what happened after we did a detailed forensic analysis after the attack was it appears that someone hacked the financial administrator's email. Let's start there. There was not certain security on there that would have helped prevent this. For example, no multi-factor authentication. You probably heard of MFA. There's also no other detection, anything that could have prevented or helped someone know that it's happened. Then the hacker sat in there, it looks like, for about 2 to 3 weeks, reading email, both historical and otherwise, searching for things, trying to get a sense of who it was they just hacked. Your first eyebrow right there. Who it is they just hacked? Chances are, if you're being hit by an attacker, they don't actually know who you are until they hack you. They are shotgunning the internet right now, using automation and AI tools, and just trying to get a hook. It's not a specific where it's not the sniper approach, right? Where they're picking and choosing the targets. Not most of the time. It's more often not the spray and pray approach. We're just going to try to get as anyone we can because it's super easy for us to do so. So they got this organization. They figured out, hey, this organization was working with an engineering firm. They were getting ready to redesign a historical building as part of their yearly goals. And this engineering firm was in charge of helping them design it in a way that wouldn't, diminish the historical relevance of the building. Well, this engineering firm had agreed beforehand, it was in their contract, to send the financial administrator billables in milestones on a semi-regular basis. And they gave like a range of dates, basically, when the financial administrator could expect the invoice. And they were pretty broad, but they did exist. And so what happened was this attacker looked at that and said, okay, we can work with this. They got a copy of the engineering firm's official invoice template. So it looked identical to what the engineering firm had used. They created an email address that was one letter off from the actual engineering firm's. And they waited till roughly when the first milestone was supposed to be submitted. Wait till that time frame. And they sent them an invoice. Well, the invoice was a lot more than the financial administrator was expecting based on her knowledge of the project. The project had been speared by the chief executive officer and the COO, and she was just told about it so she could know to pay the bill. And but fortunately, in the invoice, there was a phone number for supposedly the engineering firm that you could call if you had questions. And that's exactly what she did. She called. Fortunately, the number she called routed to the hackers, and the hackers were able to convince her through a couple of phone calls that this was legitimate. And they even managed to redirect her and say, hey, instead of wiring us money, because her bank didn't like her wiring that much money, obviously, and other things, you can just send us certified mail. And here's a PO box in like Utah, I think is where it was at. And you can just send us a certified mail, the certified check, and cashier's check, and we'll be on our way. So that's what she did. And she mailed them a huge chunk of money. And they waited a little bit, and they did the same thing again. They sent another invoice. She mailed them another check, and they waited a little bit longer. And then they did the same thing again, and she mailed them another check. And at this point, she had mailed them over $115,000. Obviously, the flags had gone up, and she said, hey, I probably should check. So she finally reached out to her boss, the COO or the CEO at the time, and said, "Hey, does this sound right to you guys?" And of course, the answer was no. We've been working with this architecture firm. They hadn't kept the financial ministry in the loop. They haven't even sent their first asked for the first payment yet. They called the architect. They called sorry, not the engineering firm, and the engineering firm said, "Yeah, we haven't sent you any invoices." They did a look back and they realized, "Oh crud, we've just been defrauded. We've been hacked somehow." How did these people know about this? How do they know what to send us? How do they know that we are even working with this engineering firm? Of course, all these questions were flying through their mind. They had insurance, fortunately. Yes, there is insurance for this stuff, and we'll talk about that after the story. But they had insurance for this called cyber insurance. It was an aggregate of between $200 to $500,000, I believe, is somewhere in that range. And so they thought, great, we'll just submit a claim, and they'll take care of this, right? That's what the insurance company is here for, and that's true. The insurance company is there as a financial last stop. That being said, most people don't know this. When you engage cyber insurance, you're going to get two things you have to do before you get any kind of money. You got to engage what's called a breach coach. The insurance firm will provide for you. A breach coach is a lawyer that specializes in cybersecurity law. And you also have to engage an incident response firm. This is a firm that specializes in incident response and building legal reports and figuring out who done it, how did it happen, basically painting the picture 100% for the carrier. Both these firms run about $450 an hour a piece. They are not cheap, and they take about 2 to 4 months to do their work, as I indicated. So the next 2.5 months goes by, and the forensic firm does their thing. The breach coach does their thing. They do a thorough investigation. All the while, this nonprofit, um, they were running a real deficit. They didn't have $115,000. That was a strain on their finances. Like it's not huge. As I mentioned, between 5 to 12 people, it wasn't a huge amount there wasn't a huge amount of liquid cash in their accounts. This is a huge chunk of change. And so they're waiting desperately. Okay, the insurance company's going to reimburse this. Okay, the insurance company's going to reimburse. The insurance company's going to reimburse. We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. They finally sit down, ended the incident response with the breach coach, and unfortunately have come to find out something that most cyber insurance policies have inside of them, but nobody knows to look for unless they're checking. A sublimit. What is a sublimit, you ask? Well, I'm not, disclaimer, I'm not an insurance agent, but a sublimit is where the insurance carrier says, sure, we'll give you an aggregate of $300,000 to $500,000, but for these specific kinds of cyber activities, right? Hacking, for financial fraud, ransomware, right? Like the list goes on and on. We're only going to pay a much smaller amount. And unfortunately for them, their policy did have a sublimit of $15,000 for financial fraud, which is what the carrier said happened here. They couldn't find any damage. There was no ransom. They just simply tricked them into giving them money. The hackers tricked the organization into giving them money. So all in all, the hackers, for about 2 months of their time, over time the scam ran out, made $115,000, and the nonprofit lost over $100,000. And to make matters worse, because they were a nonprofit, they had a fiscal shortfall and an ethical obligation to inform their donors that this event had happened. Probably imagine how that conversation went when they went to the donor and said, we just lost $100,000 of the money you donated to us, and we have to ask for more money to make ends meet. Terrifying, right? Absolutely terrifying. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is this is actually a pretty common story. More often than not, no one wants to talk about this because it's terrifying and honestly embarrassing. But what we're seeing is on the security challenge, it's a real challenge to be a defender in this day and age. Half of companies lose 11 to 20% of their client base after they get ransomware. If you can survive long term, they'll probably come back. But those first 6 months, as we'll talk about in a second, are a real bear. People do have good short term memories about giving their data to companies that just got hacked. 92.4% of attacks are delivered via email. Why? Why are they delivered via email? Because everybody has an email, right? We all have one. On average, it takes 120 days to discover a breach after it happens. That's in case, obviously, no money's taken or ransomware is deployed, where you'd obviously notice really quickly. But once they get in, they have basically about 4 months to figure out what they're doing and where they want to go. Do they need that much time? Typically, no. They're pretty efficient, but it takes about that much time to notice that anything's even happened. 58% of malware attack victims are small businesses, and 60% of small and medium-sized businesses go under within 6 months of a breach. The short-term effects of a breach are devastating, as I mentioned in the first clip. Losing 20% of your revenue on top of dealing with all the legal expenses, the loss of cash flow, the disruption to operations. For a small business, that's really hard. Even if you have a lot of cash in the bank, that's difficult. And honestly, I've never heard someone go, every time I've done multiple of these cyber attacks now, every small business, every government agency, every nonprofit that I've ever worked with that said the same exact thing. I never want to go through this again. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. It's emotionally draining and it can break the entrepreneurial spirit of a lot of people. Let's continue. No problem. You have cyber insurance, right? Right? Yeah, cyber insurance. This one's interesting. Cyber insurance, and disclaimer once more, I am not an insurance agent. Absolutely go talk to your local professional liability agent. I recommend talking to someone who specializes in business errors and omissions or even cyber altogether about this stuff, just because it is a very unique discipline. But cyber insurance used to be 2 pages. If your business was between $1 to $3 million, it was 2 pages, $1,000 deductible, and off you go. You have $1 million in coverage. No questions asked. That's not how it works anymore. There is detailed risk analysis in every single one of these warranties, as they're referred to as in the applications. These applications feel like audits. They often ask for esoteric knowledge about certain technologies, like are you using EDR? How often are you doing penetration testing? What's your vulnerability scan methods? Um, there are also the policies, as I mentioned before, are more often than not, if they're sufficient with a good aggregate. I usually recommend getting at least $1 million personally. I carry closer to two. But they'll become with sublimits inside of them for the most common forms of cybercrime, where they will be a lot less than that. And honestly, that's a good policy still. The very few policies just give you blanket $1 million anymore. It's not how it works. The sphere is changing rapidly. And so whenever you get cyber insurance, you need to ask yourself these questions. When was the last time you filled out the application form for a cyber insurance policy? What happens if you're not 100% accurate on the application? What happens when insurer says you failed to maintain your business to industry accepted standards? And before you say, Logan, that'll never happen, it already has. Travelers actually sued, I believe the company's name was ICS back in 2022, for basically saying on their insurance application they had MFA in place, when it turns out, spoilers, they didn't have MFA in place on everything. Travelers won that court case. They didn't pay it was a ransomware insurance claim. They didn't pay a dime. And they actually won the appeal too. So they went to ICS and said, look, we're not going to pay you your claim, but you stop appealing, we won't make you pay our lawyer costs. That was the settlement. So this is court precedent now. And last but not least, if you have cyber insurance, have you ever looked over the sublimits and exclusions? There's a lot of language in there. If you have cyber insurance, I would recommend talking to your local E&O or insurance agent or even an attorney to look over the contract. Carriers want to do right, but it's not a blank check, not anymore. Like I'm not trying to pin all the blame on the carriers here. I think they're doing the best they can in the situation there is, but cyber insurance is just not a blank check. Like we'll be fine, they'll reimburse us. No, they sort of like saying you're driving under the influence right now. The way they view it, if you're not taking meaningful cyber risk mitigations, it's the equivalent in car insurance if you were driving under the influence, if you were driving recklessly, if you're breaking the law. Like there's a level of gross negligence and willful misconduct that they consider, and that standard is moving. We didn't talk that much about MFA 5 years ago. Now it's everywhere. You have to have MFA. And spoilers, seriously, if you don't have MFA, go set up MFA on your email, on your critical SaaS accounts. It's absolutely essential in this day and age. But that's one of the first questions they'll usually ask you on these applications. JP Morgan made a big headline news in January 2024, January 24th, 2024. That's a fun date to say, where they're telling point blank they're facing 45 billion hacking attempts per day. Per day. There's only 8 billion people on the planet. What does that mean? Hacking has been automated. It has become commoditized. What we're seeing is these people who actually invent hacking tools are creating subscription services and selling the hacking tools to people on the dark web who don't have the skills to create them, and basically have created a commodity cottage market. It doesn't require technical skills to be a hacker anymore. You can just be a guy across international borders. Say, hypothetically, we like to pick on them a lot, but allegedly Russia has a lot of hackers. Why? Well, why would Russian hackers target the US, hypothetically? Well, for starters, Russia doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. So even if they get caught, what's going to happen to them? Exactly. Nothing. There's no risk. And when you tell me that I can just pay for a click and point tool, I mean, if you ever use Gmail, Gmail is very click and point. These hackers are creating tools that are very similar to Gmail. They have click and point, and they can just pass it to someone, say, pay me a subscription in Bitcoin or Monero, and I will let you use my tools, and you can run all the sophisticated cyber criminal campaigns you want with the ease of of clicking a button. That is the real challenge right now that we're facing, what's changed the market. Now, that obviously is going to open up a ton of questions. So before I go into our questions, just to show you how often this is happening, I just Googled Columbus, Ohio data breach. And holy guacamole, there's a lot. I'm based out of Columbus. Let's talk about this. So this year so far, Builders Mutual and Progressive both got popped in a data breach. Ohio Lottery got ransom. They believe they got not ransomware. Sorry, Ohio Lottery was hacked as well. And the Columbus healthcare provider here in town, hospital, was also hacked. I mean, the list goes on and on. Just Google cyber attack, ransomware, whatever, your city, and you'll see tons of articles. And this is just the stuff that's forced to go public. Again, I have to stress that being hacked is embarrassing. This is an epidemic, and oftentimes it's a silent epidemic until it literally can't be silent anymore. And we are seeing on that side as well more and more legal ramifications for not disclosing. So I'm going to pause here for a second, 60 seconds. Go ahead and put your questions in chat. Someone will be answering them with you, and then we'll keep on trucking. 60 seconds starting now. Welcome back. We're going to keep on moving to the last third of our presentation. Hopefully, there's some good questions in the chat, and you'll have those questions answered in the comments thread. The last part of this presentation is, okay, you've talked about the problem and you've talked about the scale of it, right? What am I supposed to do about it? That's the last part of this presentation. And I think that's a very valid question to have at this point. And that's really what you're here for, right? So first question you have to ask yourself is, when will you deal with it? Because it's not going to go anywhere. Hackers are treating it like a job, as I mentioned, to steal your information. And because of this, the security landscape, excuse me, has changed dramatically even over the last year. Used to be a hacker, as it's portrayed in the media, it still is portrayed that way. Guy in a hoodie with a glowing keyboard, right? That's what most people think. Actually, it's a guy who looks closer to me. He's got a headset. More often than not, I was saying some kind of home office or a cubicle. He works daily hours because he treats it, and he has even infrastructure, colleagues. They get in gangs. They act like companies. They treat it like a job. That's what they view this as. They don't view this as hacking businesses or perpetrating crime. They treat it as an honest living. They treat it as a job. And that's the real reason why this has changed. It's no longer hacktivism. It's no longer technically skilled people in the background that only have so many hours. It's ordinary people with easy click and point tools treating it as a 9 to 5 job. And that's absolutely terrifying to me. Because it's all about the money. Last thing I'll leave on this, statistic wise, is I was reading a stat from 2021, and almost 70% of all cybercrime in 2021 that was reported could be indicative of financial motivations. Less than 5% of cybercrime that was reported in 2021 was suspected to be performed by a state state level backer, like a government, like espionage hacking. All about the money for these criminals. They want to make money. If they can work 3, 4 weeks and make $100,000 USD payday, absolutely worth it to them. So let's ask ourselves some questions. Remember my little slide before, the 5 ways to manage your risk? We're going to go through those real quick. So, can you avoid it? Statistically speaking, that one's a definitive no. You cannot avoid it. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. These criminals are shotgunning the internet. You saw JP Morgan, they're being attacked 46 billion times per day. Automation has made it wickedly easy for them to keep going. You will be attacked at some point. It's just a matter of time. Okay, that one's easy enough. Can we share it? That's a trickier one. Most of the time, the answer is no. Microsoft, there's certain cases that's not true and you can share it, but SaaS platforms, for example, like Microsoft and Google, they're specifically waiving all liability for risk involving individual account or business level account access in their terms and conditions. To illustrate this point, Google actually lost a decent chunk of data for businesses earlier this year, about 6 months worth of data, and they said, sorry about your luck. Our terms and conditions absolve us of any liability. What we got back is what you got back. So yeah, that one's not fun. Can we transfer it? It depends, right? Channeling my attorney, my business attorney, I love how he says that all the time. It depends. Not always. You should try, and cyber insurance, I will never tell someone not to get that. The premiums are higher than they used to be. They are stabilizing a little bit. I'm seeing across the board. I do expect another hike this year. The applications are requiring the insured to test domain-specific cyber risk mitigation measures. There's cost of downtime operationally. The policies often have exclusions or sublimits, not to mention the sheer fact that they take the quickest, if from beginning to end, you usually will see a payout is 2 months. So if you lose significant funds, the insurance isn't just going to come and write you a check next week. So can we transfer it? It depends. Sometimes yes, not always. So that right there, can't avoid it, can't transfer it, we can't share it. What does that leave us with? Well, there's only 2 real valid options on the table to meaningfully deal with this risk. We can, I put retain an unsustainable risk posture in cyber risk. And it is unsustainable. I don't think that's appealing for most people. That leaves the last one, reduce the risk to a more reasonable level. That's why cybersecurity is a thing. Cybersecurity is about reducing the risk. I drive every single day knowing full well I could get in a car accident and pass away. That's sad to think about, and I hope it never happens, but do I lose any sleep about it? No, I don't. Why? Well, for starters, I drive fairly safely. I stay within speed limits. I wear my seatbelt. My car has tons of safety mechanisms and features built into it, everything from proximity sensors to airbags. And I also carry the appropriate amount of insurance. So if I accidentally cause damages to my car or to somebody else that I need to financially restitute, like I'm covered there. I have done everything I can think of, both my actions and the insurance I carry, to reduce my risk to something I'm comfortable with. I don't lose sleep over it. I'm in a place where is the risk eliminated? No, risk is never eliminated, but it's manageable where I'm at. We want to do the same with cybersecurity risk in our businesses. We recommend to figure out how to do that because every business is unique. A cybersecurity risk assessment is essential. You need to figure out what your unique cyber risk exposure is to your business and how you do business. 99% of the time, I have found when I've done a risk assessment, there's always risk exposure. But where the risk exposure can be found and how it's dealt with can change from business to business, depending on how they're built, how their infrastructure works, how their employees are trained, and how their employees operate, what platforms they're using. The list goes on and on and on. Every business should, and I believe it's actually becoming more and more of a business essential. And if you want to check it out, there's a video on our website talking about the risk assessment and some of our clients' thoughts on that. We'll just love to take you there. But a cybersecurity risk assessment can paint the picture for you. And risk management, at the end of the day, is a business leadership decision. So what it should do is paint cyber risk, take the technical jargon out as much as possible, paint it into common terms that business leadership can understand, and make actionable decisions over. Business management's the one that decides the insurance policies. Business leadership is the one that decides how much risk appetite they have. The CEO specifically decides how much risk appetite we have, with the C-level executives helping him translate and understand what the company's current risk posture is. That's part of the gig. So a cybersecurity risk assessment is just adding on to that already history path that we have. So what does a cybersecurity risk assessment look like? That can vary depending on what firm you look for. First off, you want to base usually a tactical cybersecurity assessment is what I recommend starting with. That's a broader cybersecurity risk assessment that can incorporate more general risk categories that are found throughout most businesses. I base mine specifically on NIST and what NIST defines as risks and recommendations. So what I would recommend, this would look like if you went through us to do a cybersecurity risk assessment. This is the path of what it looked like. We'd sit down with the executive sponsor, whoever that is, usually a C-level operative at the company. We've done CFOs, COOs, CEOs, CTOs, CIOs, you name it, right? Like the executive sponsor who's championing this whole thing to get done. We'll look at whatever security policies you already have, whether you have wire and fraud instructions, you have a WISP, that's a written information security policy, incident response plan, etc. If you don't have it, we'll take a look at should you have it, right? Like some policies just make sense for every company. Others might not make sense for others. It's all, again, the risk assessment is customized to each business. If you have a physical environment, not everybody does, but if you do, we'll take a look at the equipment on site, make sure there's no unpatched firewalls, et cetera, et cetera. Network and data review, this is usually the SaaS architecture combined if you have physical hardware for networks. This can be as simple as looking at Google Drive, looking at OneDrive. A lot of times people leave that stuff open to the internet without even realizing about it. They might save data on their computers that's easily accessible via a phishing link. We have a test we actually run. You can check out our website to see it, where it's basically simulating a phishing link and what it can get to if you just click a phishing email and run an executable on your computer that doesn't require administrative privileges. Most often we get PII that people didn't know they had when we do that, and it's just transmitted in plain text. We want to make sure that if you have it, you know where it's at, and you can decide whether or not you want to keep it. Intellectual property review. This is the secret sauce of every business, right? Makes you unique. And we don't want that getting out. If you have any intellectual property, we work a lot with biotech companies, for example. You want to make sure your drug patent isn't floating around somewhere you're not aware of. It shouldn't be, right? Like you should be keeping hard control over that. We want to make sure it's not. User and systems reviews, make sure people are up to snuff. They're not doing anything too bad when it comes to configuring their computers. Dark web research. You've probably heard of the dark web. Turns out most websites that have been around nowadays, if they've been around for more than 5 years, have already been hacked once or twice. And people aren't good at changing their passwords. So a lot of passwords, a lot of usernames, a lot of credit cards, a lot of financial information just floats on the dark web and public text because these hackers don't want it anymore. So they dump it in forums and online threads where we can just look at them. You know where to look. We know where to look. So we're going to look to make sure there's nothing floating out there that you're not aware of that you need to change and protect yourself against. And last but not least, the good old team behavior test. We want to make sure your team's up to snuff. We want to make sure your team knows how to recognize a phishing email, knows not to give too much information if they get a phone call. It's not meant to shame them, but if, for example, there's a couple members of your team that are more susceptible to clicking a phishing email than others, wouldn't you want to know that, especially if they're in sensitive positions? Executive assistants are great targets, for example. You want to make sure your executive assistant's street savvy against this stuff because they often hand tons of stuff goodies the hackers want. They target those executive assistants all the time. VAs are also in that category. Virtual assistants, sorry. So I recommend a cybersecurity risk assessment. Well, if you want to learn about doing a professional one from us, for example, we'll never turn you down. There's two ways you can do that. You can either scan the QR code over here, or you can go to the link in the chat, cyber.tabernacle.tech/cyber strategy session. That is a free, no strings attached, 15-minute consultation if you want to see if the risk assessment's right for you. If it's not, no worries. We're okay with that. But if nothing else, you'll get 15 minutes of professional's time where you can workshop something, figure stuff out. But maybe you're not there yet. And that's okay. I would love to meet you. I'd love to work with you. But I also know it takes time to build trust. And honestly, maybe you want to see what your options are. Totally respect that. What we do also have as well is a free, we call a risk quiz. Now, to be clear, not a full-blown risk assessment, right? This is not supplemental risk assessment, but it's a great place to start and see about just a quick checklist of, hey, do I have these things? Is there any kind of outstanding risk in my organization I need to deal with that I can do on my own? I would charge someone a decent chunk of money to do this for them. My time is valuable. I am giving this away for free Just go to the QR code or go to cyber.tabernacle.tech/quiz. It'll take you to a form. You just need to fill out your name and your email address so we know where to email the quiz to, and you'll receive an email usually within 5 minutes with the quiz attached, and you can go from there. Again, no obligations, no cost. This is just a free risk quiz that you can start with if you're not quite ready to look into a full risk assessment. Get it. Um, no one, and honestly, our biggest objective with this event today is just to make sure that people are aware of this issue and they're being proactive about it, however that looks like, whatever we can do to contribute to that conversation. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for your time. My name is Logan Edmonds. Again, I'm CEO of TTS. Stay safe out there. Every year, this issue is getting worse. Cybersecurity is going to become a must for every business, and every business has to make its own unique decisions on how it's going to address that. I just want to be a resource to the community. You can find me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. I'm usually posting stuff. I try to keep it pretty high level and valuable as opposed to staying away from salesy stuff. So hopefully you get some use out of that. Take care. Have a great rest of your week, and